We judge ourselves by our intentions, and others judge us by our behaviors.
If our intentions don't match our behavior, we have a gap, and that gap is what gets us in trouble. It's people that have helped you, it's people that have hurt you, right? They all influence us in some way. Who knows that you're angry first? You or the person you're with?
You know, when you put all of this work into making some important changes at work in your leadership role, either to move your team to a higher level of performance or improve certain cultural dynamics, and somehow it didn't quite land. And it can be incredibly frustrating and defeating because you've put in all of this effort and you're not seeing the results of that effort. Now, here's what might be missing that what our guest is going to talk about today. It's the knowing-doing gap. Your intentions are invisible, but your behaviors are seen in real time by everyone around you. And that gap between what you mean to do and what people experience is where the greatest challenge lies. Now, our guest today has worked with some of the brightest leaders in the world, super high achievers who invest enormous energy, time, and money into strategic thinking and business acumen and technical mastery. And she's learned that that isn't enough. So in this episode, you will discover why self-awareness without self-management is just expensive navel-gazing, and how to do both well. And you'll learn some of the frameworks that explain why your progress feels like it's stalling when it might actually be compounding, and how to solve the right problem with the right tool. If you've ever been blindsided by feedback or struggled to scale your impact or wondered why your good intentions keep landing wrong, this conversation will help you get the frameworks to finally close that gap. So join us today as we explore why self-understanding isn't soft skills, it's the ultimate leadership skill. Hi, it's Dr. Mira Brancu, and welcome back to the Hard Skills. Margaret Andrews ran the MBA program at the MIT Sloan School of Management for 7 years before becoming an associate dean at Harvard University. She teaches several graduate courses, including creativity and innovation, leading with emotional intelligence, and managing yourself and leading others, which I did have a chance to read, and I love it. And you see in the background, if you're watching this with us, she's got her book in the background. She has been featured in many media outlets, from the Wall Street Journal to Times of India, and her book, Manage Yourself to Lead Others, which follows the course that she teaches, was recently published by Hachette. So welcome, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Absolutely. So let's start with a comment at the heart of your work. I really love this comment. We judge ourselves by our intentions, and others judge us by our behaviors. Tell me more about why that is so important to understand.
Yeah, I think that what's behind that is that you said it actually very well in the intro, was that our intentions are actually not visible to anyone, right? We think everyone can understand our intentions, but they can't. And also, even if they could, if our intentions don't match our behavior, we have a gap, and that gap is what gets us in trouble. So the idea here is that I would say lots of people, I would even venture to say most people, have good intentions for being a good team member, a good boss, a good leader, etc. And yet, very oftentimes, what gets in the way are our behaviors. And so that is what people are judging us by.
Yeah, I love that. And it's reminding me, I've gotten really obsessed with watching Dr. Orna, who does couples therapy. And one of the things that keeps coming up in those sessions is one part of the couple or both get very frustrated. I've been working so hard. Why can't you see this? And it's because there's a difference between what we intend and what it looks like on the outside. So it's not just at work, it's at home, it's everywhere. And knowing how to bridge that gap is so important.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because everything that we talk about, really about self-understanding and self-management, is equally, if not more, applicable in our personal life. There's a fair amount of research that says that we tend to think we have this work personality and this home personality.
Mhm.
And yet, they're actually not that different. If you were to ask somebody that you work closely with and somebody that you live with to tell about you, they would oftentimes use very similar words. So what helps at home helps at work and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah, you bring yourself everywhere. So,
Yes.
you probably should know yourself well enough to see what you're bringing around, right? So,
Exactly.
what led you to teaching on this topic? Because before the book came out, you were teaching about this. So, tell me a little bit about that journey to teaching it and then being inspired to then write about it.
Yeah. So I've been teaching the class Managing Yourself and Leading Others for close to 20 years at this point.
Wow.
And of course, like so many books or classes or whatever, it was born of my own problem. So it
Yes.
was, I had a job one time where I was, leading a lot of people and I thought I was kind of rocking it. I had some very good results, etc. And one day my boss tells me, he said, yeah, you're not self-aware. And it was not said in a, here's something you probably can't see, let me help you kind of thing. It was said in a way more like you're broken and can't be fixed.
Ooh,
And
like this is a global aspect about you.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, it took me a while to really hear those words and really what they meant and things like that. And I tell people, and this is absolutely true, is that sometimes very valuable gifts come in ugly packages, and that was
Mm.
exactly what was going on there. But when I really kind of settled down and thought about it more, the worst part of the story was that he was right. That I had a difficult relationship with him. And I had some people on my team that were kind of afraid of me. And that was, talk about intentions and behaviors. That was absolutely not my intention. But it was the result. And so I really wanted to fix this. I wanted to figure it out. I wanted to change it, etc. So I went on a massive search for anything that I could find that might help. And what I kept kind of bumping into was said in many different ways, but the idea that you have to understand and manage yourself before you can lead others effectively, right? You can lead others, but oftentimes it's not that effective if you don't understand and manage yourself. And so I, went through the process myself and, had to really think about it and change some behaviors. And really, it's not easy. And so after I did that, I just, I tell people if you've ever seen that movie Alien and there's the iconic scene there when Alien bursts out of that person's
Yes.
chest, right? And that is the way this class was for me, that this class just had to come out. And it was like it was leading me to create this
Mm.
class. And so that's how it happened. And then, I never had intended to write a book, but people kept asking me about it. And I did a keynote speech about it, and that kind of led to the book. And so that's how it all came about.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious, you've been teaching it for so long, 20 years or so. Have you noticed any changes over time, differences, generational differences? Have people gotten better at self-awareness or not? Any changes over time that you've noticed about the class and how people engage?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the one thing I'll say is I think people are more distracted now than they've ever been. And you can definitely see that. And I think that just, ratchets up the anxiety and the frustration and things like that. But I would say
Yeah.
not really. I think that, I tend to attract in the class as well as the executive program a lot of really high achieving people. And, kind of that sweet spot for me is the people that are, very smart, very hardworking, high achieving people, but they get to this point where what they've been doing just isn't working anymore. They're just not getting that traction. And that's when I see them. And that's when they are ready to really look at something different. Because, I've told people I don't teach this to undergrads because if I told you this stuff when you were, 18, 20 years old or something like that, you'd look at me and go, well, duh, right? This is so obvious, right? And I'm like, Yeah, it is obvious, but we don't do it, right? Once you get into the work world, you're sort of swept with the stream and things like that. But I
Yeah.
think once people hit that wall, they want to know, how do I fix this?
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked in your book was how you first explained this framework about the S curve, what it looks like over time, which is different, and how it applies to high achievers in particular when it comes to self-development and growth. So I would love for you to share with our audience this concept and how it applies to high achievers in particular.
Yeah, great. So I'll say the S curve comes in around self management. So, we do the work, and I can talk about that later if you'd like, around how do we really understand ourselves? Then we have some insight, right? We have some insight. Aha, okay, this is why I'm doing this. And so then we think about, okay, what do I want to change? What, in particular, behaviors? And, some very common ones are, I want to learn to listen better, whether it's stop interrupting, or I want to stop negating what everybody says, or I want to delegate better, right? See, there's some of the very common ones. So you pick one or two skills and you start with one, and that's where the S curve begins. And the idea is that we think of, if you look at along the x-axis is time and along the y-axis is results, that we think that when we try something new, it's, we get better over time. And that's true, but it doesn't look like this linear thing. It looks more like an S curve. So if you're listening to this, imagine an S curve, keep the bottom of it where it is anchored, but then stretch out the top of it and move it to the right, right? So it's this kind of elongated S curve. And the idea of the S curve is that in the very beginning, you're not good at all at whatever you're trying to do. Take listening better. Your brain is telling you, interrupt, tell them that's a stupid idea, whatever it is. And it's hard to catch yourself. And so you're going to not be good at it. So you might read a book, you might watch people that do it well, etc. But you kind of have to put it together yourself. So you're making mistakes left, right, and center. And sometimes you overcorrect or undercorrect, and you're a mess. Right in the very beginning. But then, with practice and feedback and things like that, you get better slowly and then quickly, right? You get that ramp up. And then as you approach mastery or being much better at it, it sort of levels off, right? So then that's time to try a new skill. And so when you start a new S curve, the hard part, and this is, I think, what you're talking about, is that when you start a new behavior or skill, your performance usually goes down, right? Because you're trying something new, you're not doing it the way you're used to doing. And that is super hard for somebody who's a high achiever, and in particular, people that are high up in the hierarchy. Because when you're making mistakes, more people are seeing you do it. And that's embarrassing. So people tend to say, oh, that's not me. This is what got me here, whatever my way of doing things. And I love Marshall Goldsmith's saying he says, yes, but what got you here won't get you there. And to me, that's the whole point of the S curve is, the quicker you get on that S curve and work through those stupid mistakes, the quicker you're going to get to mastery.
Yeah. And what I especially love about the framework, and especially like if you could see the visual with the second or the third S after the first, skill or set of skills are developed, is that it stretches out longer. And we often assume, especially high achievers, we often assume that once you're able to master the sort of most basic fundamental skills of your job as a leader, that everything will just come easier and easier and easier. Well, in fact, what you're saying, which I just really appreciate, is no, you're mastering way more challenging skills at higher levels, and that is going to feel like it's going to actually take longer. And there's going to be some backtracking too, or some slowing down in your skills as you're developing those more challenging, higher level skills over time. Did I get that right? About how
you did,
you're
absolutely,
sort of
which is why I love the title of your podcast, right? Is the hard skills. Let's be clear about what the hard skills really are. They're
Yeah.
these behavioral things. And we oftentimes think, oh, that's nice to have. Oh, absolutely not. The higher you go in leadership, that is your job, is listening to people, encouraging, those kinds of things and giving them feedback.
So then, going backwards then a little bit, since we talked about self-management, but what happens before you know what to change, and even while you're trying to change your behaviors, master these skills at higher levels, it takes some attending to, like, why am I getting stuck here? Why is this so frustrating and difficult? Why am I slowing down? Why am I plateauing? And all of that is self-awareness questions, right? So
Yeah.
that's really where your book starts. And how do you help people begin that process of slowing down enough, especially now in our,
Hmm.
attention deficit economy, um,
Hmm.
to know what to attend to and how to attend to it and increase their self-awareness?
Yeah, and I think you are absolutely hitting the nail on the head of where people kind of push back and, I don't have time for that, right? And I say, sometimes you have to slow down to speed up, right? So, or the old adage of why is it that we never have time to do it right, but we have time to go back and fix it, right? To me, it's the same kind of idea.
That's funny.
Yeah. So I have people start off with 6 questions around self understanding, and they're big questions. They're not something you sit down and, over a cup of coffee, answer all of them, and, now we're done. So the first question around who and who's thinking have shaped you in your life as an individual? And so this is a humongous question, right? Because it's people from your childhood, teachers, books you've read, posters you've seen, if you're the Steve Jobs kind of thing. It's people that have helped you, it's people that have hurt you, right? They all influence us in some way. So that's the first question. The second question is kind of related, and that's about, situations and events that have impacted you in your life, because they oftentimes really change our perspective. And these, I say, are lucky accidents and unlucky accidents. We all know what the unlucky accidents are: car accidents, getting sick right before the big interview, all of those kinds of things. But the lucky accidents are there too. That's the time where you turned left instead of right and you bumped into somebody and you got the job, or whatever it is, right? So the lucky accidents we oftentimes don't think of, but those are actually important too. The third question is around success, and that is your definition of success. And I say this is your definition, not your parents and not society's. It's your own. And people oftentimes give a quick answer to this one. And I say, listen, if it has something to do with reaching a certain level of an organization or having a certain amount of money in the bank, I said, you're not going deep enough. Because why is it that amount of money? Why is that position, right? What's
Yeah.
underneath that? What is it really that you're looking at as success? And that gets you right to the fourth question, which is around what are your values, your core values, and perhaps how did they change over your lifetime? Because, we start off essentially very oftentimes with our parents' values. And then as we go through life, we adjust. And sometimes we think, that's actually not my value. But our values are showing up everywhere in the way we do things and the way we treat people, etc. So really thinking about those values and to the extent you're living them and
Mhm.
not just mouthing them. Then the fifth question is around emotions. And this is, to what extent do you understand and feel your own emotions? And a lot of times people look a little bit stumped on this one and say, oh gosh, I'm not sure. And I said, well, yeah, now you know, right? Because if you're not sure, you probably aren't. And a great way into this is I ask people, I say, who knows that you're angry first? You or the person you're with? And
Mhm.
if it's the person you're with, then yeah, you probably don't understand those. And then the last question is around feedback, and that is, what feedback have you gotten in your personal life and your professional life? And, this is positive feedback, this is developmental feedback. And one of the things, I say, if you're a nerd like me, you actually probably have all your old performance evaluations. It's quite an interesting thing to lay them out all on the floor and look for the patterns,
Mhm.
because you know what? They're there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
oftentimes, the feedback that you get is related to your behavior, which is related oftentimes to managing your own emotions, right? So all of these questions kind of have these little interlocking pieces with other questions. So
Yeah.
those are them, and they're, as you can see, they're big questions.
I was just going to say, these are really, really deep questions. And not a lot of people are, they're able to usually share at a very surface level, but not a lot of people think about these at a very deep level or are even able to access it. Like, I really liked your additional prompts to even think about who gets angry first, somebody else at you or you at yourself, right? That helps. How can people know if they are getting at the core of these questions, and or what does it usually take to get at the core of these questions?
Yeah, so I would say, what does it take to get at the right level, I'll say, is time and many at bats. So what I usually say to people is the first question around who and whose thinking has, shaped you, is one of the core ones. And this one, I tell people, because this is true, my answer to that one question is 6 pages of single space
Mm.
type, right?
Oh, wow.
Because when you really go back and you think about it, and what I tell people sometimes can be very helpful is to start with a list of names, of your favorite teachers or your least favorite teachers, your best boss, your worst boss, all of these, and as you start building this list, you realize it's enormous, right? And, first boyfriend, whatever. And then what impact did they have on you? Like, what did they teach you about yourself or about the world? And what's also very common is that, I say many people might be on both sides of the ledger, that they helped you and maybe not, right? Or they gave you
Mhm.
some sense of yourself that turns out to maybe not be true. Maybe it never was, or maybe it isn't anymore. And the most common one I hear is that people say, my teacher in the 3rd grade told me I wasn't good at blank. And they
Huh.
said, it took me 40 years to know that wasn't true. And,
Wow.
and sometimes
Yeah.
it's the parent told somebody, you're really good at this, or you're really not good at this. And they said, no, that was what they wanted. It wasn't what I wanted. So I think it takes a lot of going back to it. And I tell people, as you're answering these questions, do not edit. This is for your eyes only. You don't have to share it with anyone. You can, if you want, you can talk. In fact, I think that really helps to talk to somebody about it. But, if you do the whole thing in 10 minutes, you're probably way at the surface.
That's a really great gauge. And, I often add, if you haven't done any kind of assessments, gotten lots of feedback from lots of different people at work and outside of work, haven't really engaged in that, that's a way to start, like, start asking for, how do I come across? What are my strengths in your eyes? What are the challenges that I seem to get stuck around in your eyes? I have taken a million assessments and still find out something new every time. And I'm a clinical psychologist. So that means there's plenty of room for all of us to learn more about ourselves and to incorporate that and to get, even better at self awareness and self insight. Now, you have a best boss exercise. I'm assuming like that's part of this that we're talking about. I would love to go through it with you so our audience can actually hear what it sounds like to walk through that self awareness piece that you describe. Are you willing to go through it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
It's one of my favorite exercises, and I think people oftentimes get a lot out of it. So if you're listening to this or watching it, well, I'm going to ask you some questions. And what I would highly encourage you to do is to pause the recording and to do it. Don't just, listen and go, I'll go back to it, because it's way more impactful if you really do answer the questions. So
I love it.
So what I do is ask, think of your best boss. The best boss you've ever had could be your current boss, the one right before that, the first one you had, whatever, anybody. But it needs to be somebody that you work directly for. It can't be their boss, the CEO, somebody you wish you had. It can't be a fictional character, so it can't be Ted Lasso or any of those folks, right? So that one person. So when you get one person in mind, then to think about all the reasons why this person was your best boss, right? You chose this person over everybody else. So why? What was it? The big reasons, the small reasons, the things that were important to everybody on the team and the ones you think were really only important to you. And so, go for a really long list, and, it can be anything. It can be, they were just super smart, or they were really good at whatever programming or data analytics or whatever it is. Or, it can be lots of other things that, they were a good listener, or that they saw something in you. So then to come up with that long list. So if you're listening, this is a good time to pause and create that list, right? And go for a minimum of 8, right? Some people get up into the 20s, and that's great. So, all right. So now if you're back and you've got your long list.
Now, when you say some people go up to like 20s, is it 20 characteristics about that one person? Or is it 20 people?
No, it's 20. Thank you for asking that. It's 20. It's as many as the reasons why you chose that person as your best boss, right? And I always say you can't have things like, oh, they were a great leader. I'm like, that's a huge category. What do you mean by that, right? You got to break down those big ones.
Yes. I'm going to give people an example of what that might sound like. I'll give my response to that so people can start generating their own ideas. And those of you who have been listening for quite a while probably have heard some of this, because I loved this one boss that I had. And one of them was something that you mentioned, Margaret, which is he saw something in me that I did not see in myself. That was like a huge thing. Strengths that I would have never connected to something that ended up being my profession in the future. And the second is that instead of making decisions for me about scary things, he would just give me pros and cons and let me make my decision. And another was that he didn't make any assumptions about whether I would be willing to take something on or not, simply because I had young children or was married or had other home obligations. So he didn't bring that gendered lens to it, which meant an incredible amount to me, that he still let me make my own decisions, even in that context with young kids. And so I'm just giving a few examples of that level of specificity that Margaret is asking for about, like, what made that a best boss.
Those are great examples. So I hope if you are listening to this, you will come up with your own, and, go ahead and pause until you get it. And now that you're back, now I'm going to give you another quick assignment on that. And that is, now you've got your list. Hopefully it's at least 8 long, and it may be much longer than that. Now you have to go back and choose the top 3. Right? You have to circle or highlight whatever you want. This is the acid test, right? This is the 3 reasons that really made the difference. And it's not that the others are unimportant. It's just that these 3 rise to the top. So it cannot be 2 and it cannot be 4. It needs to be exactly 3. So if you need to pause, this can take a while sometimes. So, all right. So if you're back, then the top 3. So you want to have those top 3. And then what I tell people is that, I've been doing this with, at this point, tens of thousands of people from all over the world, every industry, all of that kind of thing. And your answers, in all likelihood, fall into one of 3 buckets, because this is pretty much the way it usually happens. And the first bucket is intelligence. right? Just
Hmm.
that, wow, they're the smartest person on the team, or, smartest person I ever worked with, those kinds of things. The second bucket is around technical and functional skills. They knew the ins and outs of the tax code, or they were a whiz at search engine optimization, whatever it is. And then the third bucket is what I'll call interpersonal skills, relationship skills, emotional intelligence, superpowers, human skills that go by many names. And those are all of the ones that you gave, Mira, are in that third
Yes.
bucket. And so when
Not surprising, those are the ones I value.
but what's super interesting is, so when I do this in person with people, I have given them like 3 Post-it notes, and then I put up 3 different boards, and the IQ, the technical and functional skills, and then these interpersonal skills. And I say, okay, go put your Post-it notes on the board that they belong on. And what I have found, it's always the same, in terms of where the numbers are. And several years ago, I took down all the Post-it notes. I go home, put them in a spreadsheet, and started analyzing them. And what I found is that 85% of the reasons people give for somebody being their best boss are in that third bucket, in the interpersonal
Wow.
skills, right? And the one that you had of, they saw something in me, is a very common one. And the remaining 15% of those Post-it notes or reasons are split pretty evenly between intelligence and technical and functional skills. And so what I want to say, though, too, is that this doesn't mean that intelligence and technical and functional skills are unimportant, but they're more threshold skills, right? That you need to
Hmm.
have a certain level of intelligence and a certain level of technical and functional skills to do your job. But the more you work with and through other people, the more that third bucket comes into play.
Oh, that's fascinating. Fascinating. And that directly connects to what you've been saying about self-awareness, in that those leaders, I would guess, that are your best leaders to you, your best bosses to you, have worked pretty hard to develop sufficient self-awareness skills and self-management skills translated from the self-awareness in order to get into that 85% bucket to have emotional intelligence skills.
Exactly. Because I asked people, I said, do you think that best boss that you had understood themselves? And people go, yes. Do you think that that best boss could manage themselves, right? They have anger and frustration just like all the rest of us. Do you think they managed it well? Yeah. And then I say, do you think they understood you? Yeah. Right. And I said, but these are all the components of it. And then I asked people, I said, if the conditions were right, would you work for that person again? And I see a sea of nodding heads, right? That, we love those people, right? Because how they helped us, that they made us better.
That's right. That's right. So, and knowing that intentions don't always translate to behaviors. And even though I can picture my best boss and I can try to emulate as best as possible that boss in me, where does the gap happen between that knowledge to doing gap?
Yeah. And that's a really common one, because essentially when we're trying to develop a new behavior, we know what we should do. So I know I should pause and listen to you and not complete your sentence. And I know that I should listen and try to understand what you're saying. I know that I should listen and not be planning what I'm going to say in response, right? These are all things we know. But the thing is, very oftentimes we don't do that. And so a lot of times I will have people say, well, I know this. And I say, yes, but are you doing it? And because knowing it is not sufficient. You don't get credit for knowing that you should listen to people. And you don't get credit for knowing that you shouldn't yell at people. And you don't get credit for knowing you shouldn't micromanage people. You get credit for doing those things. And so there's the big difference. And I think one of the reasons why we have the knowing doing gap is because there's a fear of vulnerability, that, I'm not good at it yet, right? And we kind of go back to the S curve on that, that as we make mistakes and people see us make mistakes, that we say, oh, that's not me. And, I can't be making mistakes in front of people. And I'll tell people, you should tell your team what you're working on. And a very common response I get is, oh, I couldn't do that. That would make me look weak and vulnerable. And I said, you know what? Your team already knows that. Your team already knows that you need to work on listening, right? And they will be excited that you know it now too, and they will help you.
Absolutely. So you have a story about Phil, who is somebody who became a leader he didn't want to be. So I
Mm-hmm.
assume that he was somebody who, in his mind, knew what he wanted to be and knew kind of how he wanted to portray, but somehow ended up in a very different place. And so I'm curious, what does it look like? Like if you could sort of use Phil as the example or a different example, what does it look like when we're thinking we're actioning on our intentions, and yet we find ourselves in a very different place in our leadership career, shocked or surprised or disappointed or frustrated?
Yeah. So Phil was a great example. And his situation was not necessarily that he knew what his intentions were, but he
Ah,
came around to it. And that's why I love his story. So Phil was promoted into a very big job. He was on the executive team, and he said, everybody knows that you're on it because, you just sort of called out in a different way. And he was very excited about it. And he said, oh gosh, now that I'm, a big executive, I need to act like a big executive. And so, he didn't know what that really meant. So he sort of patterned himself after somebody in the organization who had, risen very quickly and things like that. And he just kind of took on a lot of those behaviors. And he said that at one point he had to fire somebody on his team. And he said it didn't go well. He said he was ultimately, he said, I was just so embarrassed with myself for how I handled it. And then he said, not that long afterwards, somebody else on his team came in and quit on the spot and said, and when he asked why, he said, the person said, because I don't want to work with somebody that treats people like that. And that was his wake up call.
wow.
And he said he just couldn't even fathom that whole idea. But he said when he looked in the mirror, he said, I don't even like what I see. And so he said at that time he took a course, and he said that, one of the exercises was, as this group, you get together as a group, what are the words that define a leader? And he said, they were throwing out all these, common ones, decisive and bold and, da, da, da. And he said, oh my gosh, none of these words resonate with me. What is going on here? And then the more he thought about it, he said the word teacher resonates with me.
Hmm.
And so he just shifted. He said, I'm going to change from kind of commanding my team to teaching my team. It's not going to be about me. It's going to be about them. And boy, everything changed there.
Hmm.
And so, but why I love his story was because he was doing what he thought he should be doing, right? Now I need to act
Yeah.
like an executive. And it just got him to a place where he didn't like himself. And that's when he got intentional about it. And
Yeah. Yeah.
he's doing really well right now.
That's awesome. And I think that the thing that I really like about that wonderful story that you could easily place yourself into, you could easily resonate with, is that we all fall victim to following other sort of external pressures or recommendations for how you quote unquote should be. And we do that with passive acceptance without questioning, does this make sense in this environment, within the current context, and based on who I am and what I can pull out of myself, right? And what your model clearly shows is you have to understand yourself first to know whether what you're hearing about recommendations about what you're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to be like, make actual sense in your context and for your skill set. And what are actually my strengths and what are my liabilities? And do I even resonate with that? And can I even align around that? And Phil could not, because the thing that he most aligned around was teaching. And the
Mm-hmm.
moment he was able to really connect with that, he was much more able to naturally think about how I can lead in my own sort of way that also fits the environment.
Yeah, yeah, and I love what you said about that too, because that is absolutely true. That if you happen to be sitting next to Phil, he is a natural teacher. He listens, he asks questions. That is his natural way of being. And so, as you say, you pull it out of yourself. That's exactly what it was. And I think that, he's happier, he's way more successful, and his team has better results. And it's because he did he did Phil. He did Phil.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Now, let's do one more framework that you describe that really like takes self-awareness and I think like literally operationalizes it in a simple framework. And that is the managing yourself model. And I like that how you applied it to both like learning about how to lead yourself, but also then how to lead others. So I'd love for you to describe for folks what does it look like to actually access that kind of self insight in order to create constant experiments with transformation into the
mhm.
changes that you want.
Yeah, yeah. So this is hard to explain for people that can't see it, but what I would say is that so we'll start off with the managing yourself model first. So what I say is that you go back and do some self-understanding, those 6 questions, right? And I have these other
Yes.
3. One is, what kind of leader are you now? What words and phrases would you use to describe yourself? Second question is, what type of leader would you like to become? Right?
Mm.
Words and phrases, etc. And then the third question is, okay, what's the delta? What's the difference between this leader you are now and the one? And that's where we get those things to manage, right? Need to listen better, need to, be more confident speaking, whatever it is. And
Mhm.
so we go back into, I'll say, our past, who and, influenced us and those kinds of questions. And from those questions, we get insight, right? You get insight from each one of those questions. But when you put them all together, you start to see patterns, you start to see trends, you start to get that aha. And that's the insight, right? So that's the goal of the self understanding. From that insight, you can say, okay, now what do I need to work on? And then you self-manage, whether it's working on delegating better or listening more effectively, whatever it is. And that is what leads to the transformational impact because you are different. The way you behave is different and people respond to you differently. So that's it sort of on the manage yourself side, but the model looks exactly the same for understanding and leading others. So the idea is you don't have to ask them about their childhood and things like that, but you got to get to know people. What floats their boat? What demotivates them? What do they do for fun? Just so you get a sense for who is this person? They're not a widget. They're a human being. And so, get to know them and you get some insight, like your boss. It sounds like your boss gave you insight on yourself, but your boss was also getting insight about you, right? And then when we know somebody, we can help develop them. And so it's the same kind of model. It's understanding first for insight, and then it's for ourselves, it's self-management, and for them, it's development. Right. So,
Yeah.
maybe work on this.
And I think where this could go wrong with especially with developing others is if you haven't done the work around developing yourself and understanding yourself well enough, you are likely to project everything about what you're working on to somebody else as if it's their issue instead of your issue.
You are spot on. You are absolutely right. That's the thing, and that's why, I'm so adamant about, you have to understand and manage yourself first. Because first of all, you're gonna have this huge gap in your intentions and your behaviors, and you're gonna feel misunderstood all the time. But
Yeah.
to your point, if we don't understand ourselves, we can't help anybody else understand themselves, right? We're gonna try to push or tell them as opposed to draw out. But both of these take time and it's not linear, right? There's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, at times as well.
Absolutely. It's not a well, yes, it's a hard skill. It's not a simple, easy skill to develop. And You already started mentioning some of the potential derailers when you're not attending to the self-awareness piece, right? And the self-management, which is, we've talked about like the projection onto others that is your
Mm.
thing. We talked about the challenges with developing your people. And, that is going to have a massive impact on your ability to be seen as a supervisor that can manage at much higher levels of the organization, right? What other kind of derailers are likely to continue over time if you're not attending to it at earlier stages? And what is the flip to this? The way that you can use these basic, quote unquote, basic self-awareness, self-management skills to literally scale into the highest levels of an organization.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of work done on derailers. A lot of this work has been done by the Hogan organization. And what they found is, what are the differences between people that derail and those that don't? And it's not that the people that don't derail aren't really smart, aren't really high achieving, don't work hard. In fact, that is common across both categories. So that's common across both of them. What is different is often when you hear about what the derailers really are, a lot of them go back to understanding and managing yourself and understanding and developing others. So, some of the big derailers, the most common ones that Hogan found were around difficulty in building and maintaining interpersonal relationships, right? If you are not aware of your behaviors and how they impact other people, that's not a surprise. It's also another one is difficulty in building and maintaining a team, right? That you have a lot of turnover and dysfunction in your team. Also, inability to develop or adapt to strategic transitions. In fact, one of the most common, you probably know this, what most common times for somebody to derail is right after a promotion. And that's because
Yeah.
we keep doing the things that got us promoted, but our job is different now.
And also, I'll add that this comes from Hogan and many others, our most likely liabilities to our strengths will come out when we are really stressed out and stretched thin, not attending, under threat, whatever that is. And we're not picking up that we need to slow down or that we're overdoing our strengths to our detriment and it's sabotaging us. And what happens in those new leadership roles is we are under a lot of stress because we're under a lot of pressure and we want to prove ourselves.
That's right. That's what high achievers do. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. It's, it's when we're stressed out, which, in today's world is a lot of the time. And to your point, exactly, that, oftentimes it's a strength overplayed that becomes our weakness. That what got us here actually might be the thing that gets us undone, let's say. And the other thing that I think is interesting about the Hogan research is that these derailing factors were there all along. But in the earlier part of our career, our results can kind of compensate for that. But as we get, higher in an organization, the scale tips. And so those liabilities become more pronounced, and that's when people derail.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Margaret, if you were to send one message out of all of the things that we've talked about today that you really want people to take away from this conversation, what is the most important message? And you can repeat your book's cover, but if it's something else.
Yeah, it's funny because it's kind of two, but they're so related. I mean, I think if I were to say, what students oftentimes come either up to me during class or after class or years later and say, wow, the thing that I really took from you was, it is the idea that we judge ourselves by our intentions and others judge us by our behavior. Because so many people realize, oh my gosh, that's what's going on. The people don't know that I mean well because I bark at
Yes.
them. But then it comes back to the idea of, right, that's true. So you have to understand and manage yourself before you're going to be effective at leading others.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll add, this is like normal human behavior biases, the fundamental attribution error, which is that when we judge others, we give them a big label like, oh, they were late because they're always late and they're like never, conscientious. But I was late because the traffic and my car and my kids and people should be understanding and all of this. So it sort of applies to this situation too, that like nobody's going to really know your situation deeply and somehow automatically infer like your great intentions mean that like it's okay that you're late. You'll have to bridge the gap between what you were intending to do, which is be on time, and how people perceive it, right? And how they interpret it. And that's just also trying to overcome biases. And the only way to do that is to be really intentional about connecting the bridge between your intentions and the actions, the behaviors that people see.
That's right. Because that's really all they can judge you on is what they see.
Yeah. Yeah. So, folks, if you found this interesting, enlightening, inspiring, you can find Margaret Andrews at www.margaretandrews.com. You can find her and I on LinkedIn. I'd love to know, I know she'd love to know what you got out of this episode and one small change that you might be willing to implement this week based on what you heard. Share it with us on LinkedIn so we could cheer you on. And if you enjoy this episode, remember that you can send it to other people. You can recommend, you can leave nice reviews on the hard skills on your favorite podcast or our YouTube channel at Dr. Mira Brancu. And if you're looking for more personalized support, leadership, or team coaching, you could also head to gotowerscope.com to schedule a consultation with me. And together, we will navigate the complexities of leadership and emerge stronger on the other side. Thank you for joining me and Margaret Andrews today on this journey. This is Dr. Mira Brancu signing off. And until next time, stay steady, stay present, stay intentional the way that she talked about, and keep building those hard skills muscles. Thank you, everybody.